in the late 1800s. And I'm also the chairman of the Chinese Association here in Gauteng. That was established in 1903 and is also the largest and the oldest Chinese association here in South Africa. Been the chairman for the last 10 years. Like I said, I'm born here, bred here, schooled here, university here, etc. And I also work at one of the investment banks, and I head up the Asia division, looking after investments from all across Asia into Africa.
Great stuff. Were you celebrating the lunar year yesterday?
I was celebrating it yesterday. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it's very subdued. But this morning we had South African Chinese community, my association. We hosted the largest international Chinese lunar festival online, where we had communities from all across the world participating in our online event. So that was super awesome this morning.
Great stuff. We're thankful for the wonders of technology, but obviously we miss that human interaction. And I've watched a few lunar year celebrations rather, and it's colorful. There's a lot of artistic flair that takes place and a lot of performing that also takes place there. And I wonder, this is the question I asked Janelle. Again, maybe I think it's me being a bit stereotypical. Do you know any karate?
So firstly, karate is Japanese.
Yeah.
So, but I do know some karate.
All right, that's great stuff. And obviously you are a fourth generation Chinese South African. Do you have any relation or association with motherland China? Do you speak any of the languages? How often do you visit there?
So I speak Mandarin and I speak Cantonese.
All right.
I think I have distant family still in China, but not that I know of that I can phone up or email or visit anytime often. My grandmother, who's 107, she may still know about them, and wow. My uncles. But and then because of my business, I would say I travel to China once a quarter.
Great stuff. Take us through childhood memories when you are now here in South Africa. You are now faced with these multiple cultures. There's a pressure to know the language. There's also some pressure to understand the political dynamic, and also as a community to remain culturally rooted, but at the same time fuse into this rainbow that we've called a nation. Take us through that childhood experience.
Absolutely. So my childhood growing up was in the 70s and 80s. And I would say it was near the tail end, I would say, of apartheid, where things were changing.
Yes.
So I would say I got it a lot better than my parents and my grandparents. So I grew up in the city, in Johannesburg City, in Ferreira's Town, whereby that was where the Chinese community and Indian community grew up. We were allowed there. Then, as I said, things started relaxing a little bit. And because of that, my parents got approval, and you needed approval, to sub-buy, and I say sub-buy, they weren't allowed to own it themselves. They had to have a white person to buy the house in the suburb. And they had to get approval from all the neighbors to say that you're allowed to live there.
Wow.
So my parents got this sub-approval, and then I grew up there in the suburbs. I always say that sometimes when you rush things, it isn't always great. So what I mean is that it may sound like, oh, wow, cool, you're lucky you get to grow up in a suburb. But was the suburb ready for you yet? I was the only non-white really there. Growing up at the school, in the early days, it eventually got better when I went to another school called Waldorf. But in the early days, going to some of the other schools, it was quite terrifying. I would be bullied all the time, laughed at, teased at because I look different, because my language is different, because the color of my skin is different. And as a child growing up, that's very hurtful because you do not see color. I did not know why would they attack me. I mean, in my eyes, I'm South African. But they would make me always feel that I was the outsider. So typically that was the very first few years that I grew up. As I mentioned, mid-school to later in school, Educating at a Waldorf school where diversity is really key, things got a lot better around that. But whenever we would go outside again, it was still very tough. Going to public pools, I still remember going into a public pool with warm baths with my family, and then getting kicked out of the one section saying, only whites allowed, and we got kicked out. And as a little child, you don't understand that. Getting on a bus, going to the Rand show, it was one of the highlights. Getting kicked off the bus and said, no, whites only. So those are the typical things that we felt growing up.
The only two things that I'll speak mostly of an experience from my own Black community. The only two things that we knew about Chinese people was one, Bruce Lee, and then number two, and then recently, obviously, because we watched the news, the focus as well as the perspective that was brought to us about China was Wuhan coronavirus. Now, again, we've now come to know of the Chinese community after the appointment of Dr. Harvard. What did in your own community be the response or the reaction when Dr. Harvard was appointed into parliament? And what have you had to do to allay the fears or assumption that some people have around her appointment particularly?
So there's a couple of questions in there, but I would start off with saying, yes, your view of the Chinese people in the early days was perhaps right. Not a lot of people know, but firstly, as I mentioned, our history goes back hundreds of years, actually. But why is it unknown? Number one, Chinese people were told, keep quiet, keep your head down, don't make a fuss, don't cause any problems. It's really tough for the ancestors, so don't create any problems. So that's number one. So that's why you wouldn't hear them. Number two, the Chinese community, even at the largest at that time, were maybe only 10 or 20,000 across South Africa during that time. So there were some people that would have seen, there were some that wouldn't. That's number two. And then number three is that, yes, you're 100% right, and I'll get to the Dr. Harvard issue now, but the common perception and the narrative that is created out there is exactly this, is that they make it such that Chinese people are this singular group, homogeneous, monolithic group. I'm a China, it means everybody. Or anybody with yellow skin, I'm a China is that, right? It doesn't mean, hey, Erwin has dreams, he has aspiration, he has children, he's a human being. Sometimes the narrative created all the time is that. And that is the issue. Because when the narrative is created like that, people on the street just keep on hearing it all the time. And unless they have that Chinese friend, family that they introduced to, or even travel to China, they have a limited perspective and they only know what their narrative is. So now, getting to Dr. Harvard.
Yes.
As a general thing, we were, as a community, proud and happy and celebrating the fact that now an Asian face, a Chinese person, is now in national government. And that's something to be celebrated. When the movie Black Panther came out, whether you like it or not, I mean, I feel myself as South African. Yes. I was also proud around that because now suddenly it's not just American. Now there's someone from Africa as well representing.
Yes.
And that pride is what we felt now when we heard of Dr. Harvard. Dr. Harvard has been in our community for many years, but I'll be very honest myself with you, is that myself, I haven't interacted with her a lot. So as a person, I can't comment too much about her, but I can just tell you though, that as a general sense, it was the feeling that now there's representation there.
Yes.
And that maybe now that they can create a better understanding of Chinese people by being there. So that's the general thing from our community.
Makes absolute sense. I also want to zoom into the conversation that we have on Facebook. Remember when I posted rather the advertisement, I said he is a 4th generation Chinese national who is a South African, and then I was rebuked. and I had to make a correction. And I said, I'm willing to learn. Kindly explain to me, one would look at you and say, he is Chinese because he looks Asian, and you saying, I'm a South African. Explain to our listeners why the differentiation between the two.
Okay. So um, firstly, it was not, I was not, let me put it this way, I was not hurt by it.
Yes,
if I was born in China and I was a Chinese national, I'm proud of that. So don't get me wrong. I have nothing against being a Chinese national. So it was more factual in that where the nationality is, I only have a South African passport. My nationality is South African. So if you said a Chinese South African, 100%, very, very happy with that. And I believe the other issue is also then, again, this narrative around what is a South African, what is a person, a human being.
Yes.
So when you look in America and then you saw Obama there, no one would question and say he's not an American, even though they know he has a Kenyan heritage, lineage, right? But yet we find that with the Asian community, in particular the Chinese community, it's always highlighted, again, because of this narrative that you're this homogenous, monolithic group. And it's just being really clear about it. And it's being consistent and fair. So I've asked you as well, if you see an Indian person also on your radio station, do you immediately say that they are a Indian national, even though they a second or third generation? And me being a fourth generation, again, it should not dictate and should not be the highlight of what it is. Again, not saying that I'm not proud of Chinese. I'm extremely proud of my heritage.
Definitely. I think also I intentionally did that because I wanted us to speak more about the issue of identity or the politics of identity. Because I think I did share in some business classes that I teach, when I speak of the ethics course, I always speak about the humanities sector in universities as being perhaps the most dangerous, in the sense that it doesn't always zoom into the nitty-gritties of what defines us as humans, as individuals, and also the ideas or the politics around race and identity. And I know many people also would say, but you can't go into any town and not find a Chinatown. So that also to them is a benign form of colonization. And many have fed into the narrative that the Chinese community is in Africa to set colonization 2.0. What do you do as the Chinese association in terms of allaying those fears and integrating or interacting with other communities?
So if I can start backwards, what do we do with interacting with the communities? I think us as a Chinese association and all the Chinese community really is to make sure that we do a lot more of educating, of integrating. Just like Dr. Harvard now, we're very happy going up there, because you get this problem of a dilemma where you say, well, you don't do enough to integrate and get people to understand you. And now when you have someone up there, they say, no. So it's always this, this ambiguity of what it is. Do you do too much or do you do too little?
Yes.
But I do believe that number one, it's really creating that understanding of the different cultures. And through better understanding, then, you won't just say a homogeneous group and you'll say, Erwin Pon is this and that. I have a friend, this and that. So that would be the first issue. The second question really around colonization. I think that one there, you can, whether it's Chinese or not Chinese, we can debate it around colonization and what it really means. I mean, here in South Africa, we could just have a look at the different groupings and say, having 20,000 or 100,000 Chinese, is that colonization? If another group has 1 million people, 2 million people, which we know they've been in South Africa for many years, are they colonizing? So that is a philosophical debate, which I think, irrespective of whether you're Chinese or not Chinese, you can debate. But this is the question. My view of colonization is whether there's this intent of taking over something, whether you really want to go in there, take over, impose your will, impose your whatever it is on the people over there. And to answer that, generally, I would say no, there is no intent to take over anything. If anything, the world right now, if we look at it, is a global village. We cannot, contrary to previous leadership, build walls and block ourselves off from other countries and nations. We as South Africans love it if we are welcomed in America, in Europe, wherever, in China. We want that. And as countries, that is where we're moving towards, a global village of people. So now, if that's happening, do you say they're colonizing or not colonizing? Like I said, that's a philosophical, deeper debate. But if the intent there is to take over, I would say no, it's not. The question even goes more around now. You see the Chinatowns growing here, this here, all over. Sure, you notice it more because it wasn't there before, and it's global village right now, and people are moving all over. And I mean, do we suddenly now in Australia, because there's been a lot of South Africans have immigrated to Australia, suddenly saying, oh, Australia has been colonized by the South Africans? Or do they accept them because of the color of their skin and they look the same as everybody else? So you don't say a thing about it.
Yes.
And just because now you notice a yellow, I hate to use the word, but a different colored skin person now, an Asian colored skin person in your community, that now you're up in arms about it. Oh, they're coming to take over. We live in a global village. Yes, there's people moving all over the place. And unless we want to build those walls and break and keep those walls up and be xenophobic about every single thing, then no, I don't believe so. I believe we're in a rainbow nation. And like I said, the most important thing is the intent. The intent there is to live in harmony, to make a living. They are human beings. They want to they have dreams. They want to send their kids to school, have a good job, marry somebody. And we'll get to your other question a little bit later on about dowries and all that. But they have dreams. You know, they're human beings like nobody else. They're like everybody else. And that's what we need to educate people for.
Did you have to remind me about dowry? That's a private matter. Also,
we can talk offline.
In 2009, when I lived in Gauteng and worked in the specialized finance area and private sector, there was a ruling that came which affected staffing policies in most companies. Most most departments were now told that when you see a Chinese person, the designation under African, Indian, white or colored, give them colored. Therefore, the affirmative action area was expanded to a degree. And then secondly, most people were up in arms when we were told that Mandarin was now going to be a considered language as part of our official languages. When the two issues came up, what was your reaction or responsibility as the Chinese Association or a Chinese South African?
So to break it down, I think those are fantastic questions. And I would even throw in there when they said that there was going to be Chinese police stations all over South Africa. I'll throw even that in as well. So those are the myths and realities, right? So yes, that BE policy that you mentioned, absolutely. It came about really because before those classifications you mentioned, black, colored, Indian,
and white.
Before it was Indian, it was Asian.
Yes.
Then I had no problem. Me as a South African, fourth generation African, I knew where to tick. That was it. What happened then was that, and what you need to also know is that part of the community maybe totals about 7,000 to 8,000 now in the whole of South Africa. That's all that definition affects. So what does it mean? It means that Chinese that were were citizen of South Africa before 1994, when the elections, you would qualify, and you would qualify on the 1949 Group Areas Act, whereby it specifically defined Chinese people as colored.
Yes.
That amount of people, like I said, does not exceed 8,000 people. Any Chinese that you see, or Taiwanese, whoever it is, Hong Kongese, you see that was a citizen after 1994 had to tick the box white. Just like any black colored person who is not a South African citizen before 1994 technically has to tick the white box because They were not a South African. The definition really came around saying, were you excluded during apartheid time?
Yes.
Were your parents or your ancestors excluded from achieving certain things? And that was the definition. So the myth that suddenly all these Chinese corporates, and we can see since that ruling until now, we do not have thousands of Chinese companies or getting mining contracts, etc., because they be, no, it didn't. It affected a small portion of the community. That's number one. Number two, you rightly said the language thing did not mean that it did not become official language. It became an extra available language, just like French, German, those other optional languages that you wanted to choose. They said, well, let's actually also put it there so that you can offer that option and make it also a formality that it is one of the languages that you can take. It was not one of the official languages. So that's the other myth. Now the other myth around
police stations.
about the police stations. What it is really is a glorified translation service center. So we do have Chinese, a lot of Chinese. Like you said, you can go into all these towns and you will see Chinese people, but not all of them speak good English. Yes. But I'll tell you this, a lot of them are targeted with crime. The need then came about saying like, okay, instead of you going to a police station whereby you do not understand anything and you cannot fill out a form, come to us as a community center. It's not even as big or as official as these community forums that police speak to know. It's not even that. It's literally go there, we'll go with you police station, help you fill out the forms. We have no jurisdiction over how it gets processed whatsoever, and we can help you follow up. So, like I said, glorified translation center is what it is.
Makes a great deal of sense. And I think most of the othering comes from the idea of sometimes innocent ignorance. Share with us a few myths as well as facts around what people perhaps do not understand in detail about the Chinese community.
So typically what we see is why is there China bashing? China bashing is now, it's because typically they find that Chinese community does not speak back, does not dispel these myths very openly. We are starting to do a lot more now, and we need to do a lot more. That's number one. Number two, the economy is not good. When the economy is not good, people need to blame something. We've just found it all the time. And Chinese economy has thrived. Chinese businesses have been doing well. So that's a fantastic target. Blame it on the cheap Chinese imports, etc., etc. This is another myth. Cheap Chinese imports. The South African rand in the 80s was so much stronger than the Chinese currency. But since then, it has deteriorated dramatically, such that now for you have 2 rand something to buy 1 renminbi. Whereas many years ago, you could have 1 rand, you could get 2 renminbi, the double. So now, how could it suddenly be cheaper to still import from China? There's something fundamentally wrong in South Africa around our production and manufacturing methods. But it's easy to blame China. So that's one of the other myths. The other myths around taking over malls, etc., those things, Chinatowns and all that. That, if you have a look, they have not been taking over the big Gateway Mall, Sandton City Mall, all those big malls. They have been taking over dilapidated malls where actually nobody wants it anymore. Nothing's happening there. They have actually rejuvenated those malls and created a thriving business. And if you go there on weekends, a lot of the people that go there are small SMEs that are now able to do more business, buy a lot of goods, go out to wherever in the small cities, small towns, and now make a living for themselves instead of traveling all the way to China, coming all the way back, not being able to afford that. And now we see so much local business and local jobs being created. So that's another myth when they say, oh, these China malls are coming up and all that. It's actually created so many local jobs. Another one is around debt traps and investments, Chinese investments they want to take over.
Yes.
Chinese investments, actually, if you look at it, there is so much competition amongst the Chinese companies. Again, I said, debunking that myth that they're this monolithic, homogeneous group. They actually, each Chinese corporate has its own targets. The CEO of that has to reach a target and get a great reward, a bonus. And he's competing against the other Chinese companies. They don't sit together and say, okay, this and that. They've got their own dreams, their own aspirations, their own targets. So now these corporates coming in are competing against each other. And you get companies like Hisense in Cape Town creating local jobs, creating local products, benefiting the local communities. Another myth about debt traps in Africa. Far from the truth. I've been in investments for the last 12 years, and I deal with all these Chinese banks. Again, the biggest thing they worry about is will the other corporate or will the other entity pay them back? Because if they don't pay them back, that's a big cross on their record. They don't get a good bonus that year. They might even get demoted. So that idea of pure debt traps is so 12 years. The people, yeah.
Sorry, you may continue.
No. These corporates try to do their best. And if your business case does not make sense, they don't go there and say, I want to take over Eskom, for example. And I'll put it into perspective. Why would they not want to take? And why does South Africa, as much as we think South Africa is the best country in the world, which I still do think, I'll give you perspective. One company in China called the State Grid of China, their turnover in 2019 was the entire GDP of South Africa.
Wow.
One corporate. So now, would you, you're trying to make friends and influence people, would you take over a small corporation in South Africa and say that you had a debt trap so you can take over the assets, so that where it makes it hardly makes a small dent on your actual economy back in China? Gold, mining, and all that. South Africa's mining, whether the miners like to admit it or not, they have quoted it many times. We are actually in the sunset phase. We're not in the startup phase.
Yes.
Our mines are very, very deep. It's so tough. Our costs are very, very high. There are so many other places that are more appealing for these investors. So the myth that they have to come into South Africa, that they have to take over assets, is a complete myth.
Most definitely. As a concluding remark, why do you feel that South Africa hasn't fully exploited or explored the partnership within BRICS, particularly looking at it from a China-South Africa relationship, from a culture point of view to economics to politics? Because I think the Chinese Communist Party is doing a sterling job, and I enjoy the fact that it's a well-oiled machine. More than that, it's become a dominant force in the world of politics as well as economics, such that it's even threatening rather the existence or the sustainability of the US dollar. Why do you feel SA hasn't taken advantage of this wonderful relationship?
So I can't comment on behalf of the Chinese government. I'm not sure what they're thinking, or the South African government. But I can tell you just from the experience and on the ground experience that I have seen, it's really about the business case. It's really about what can we do that makes sense. They will, to a certain extent, friendship to a certain extent will say, all right, we're good friends, so I will trust you. It doesn't have to be 100%. You just have to prove that it's 90% or 80%, and then I will come and help you. But no one, even if you're good friends, it's very difficult for you to say, like, there's no business case. You're absolutely going to lose in this situation and just come over and do a lot more. So what do all governments need to do? They need to make it appealing and interesting and worthwhile for other countries, whether it is China, whether it is Russia, India, Brazil, you name it, the other BRIC nations, to say, okay, we can do a lot more here. And when things are not working well here, and we continue to get these downgrades, we continue to get issues with our expenditure, you are not giving a lot of confidence, whether it's to Chinese investors, to any type of investors coming in to South Africa. So the most important thing is get that confidence and get that consistency up so that you can encourage and then you can entice overseas investors from any country to come into South Africa.
Definitely. Spoken like a true investment banker. And lastly, but not least, can you go back to the Lobolo issue of the dowry? I'm told that there is a village in Mozambique where most of the kids have their parents, I think mostly their daddies are from China. I think that it was a construction company or something. And there's a sea of black kids who look Chinese. When are we seeing that in South Africa as a closing remark?
Well, I think, like I said, each person is an individual.
Yes.
I think that it's just great. I think that we're breaking down barriers. I mean, I think you've seen it with Dr. Harvard already. Harvard is not a traditional Chinese surname.
Yes.
You see it across, it's happening. And as we continue to grow the Rainbow Nation, I'm sure we will see a lot more of this in the future.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I was in conversation with Erwin Pon, the chairman of the Chinese Association of Gauteng. He is a fourth generation Chinese South African, an investment banker, and a proud South African. Thank you so much for taking time out of your hectic schedule to share insights as well as allay certain fears and dispel some myths also created around the Chinese community. It's been a pleasure.
Toki, thank you so much for having me. It was also great talking to you.
It's a pleasure. I'm going to play you out with a song by one of ancient groups in South Africa. It's called Stimela, and the title is Go On Living Your Life. That's what you must do. And thank you so much again for taking time to be with us. And thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.